To the Point with Michael Williams.
The issues in the race for Congress and area ranging from guns, should there be more or less restrictions, the problems Lake Okeechobee has, what can be done there so there are no more summers with toxic algae, that and much, much more. Good morning and welcome. We're talking about a nationally watched race for Congress, District 18, including Martin, St. Lucie, and parts of Palm Beach County. Brian Mast, the freshman Republican, finishing his first term as the U.S. representative in the district. The Republican facing opponents Dave Cummings and Mark Freeman, and the Republican primary upcoming. We've had Mr. Cummings as a guest. We will have Mr. Freeman upcoming. And the Democrats, Lauren Bear and Pam Keith, have also been our guests thus far.
You've been busy.
Yes, we have, but no busier and certainly not as busy as you were talking about the schedule you keep. Congressman, let's talk right off the top. Last week we're talking to our guest, Mr. Cummings, about the Santa Fe massacre. We had Parkland. You took what your supporters say, and even some of your opponents say, was a courageous stand when you went on to the editorial pages of the New York Times and said no more assault weapons. Talk about that. You acknowledge there could be a political casualty in all this. It could be me. Talk about it.
I never worry about being a political casualty. Part of what made me good at my job as a bomb technician, I think, was that I never worried about becoming a casualty. If I was serving something more important in myself, this is the way that I look at it, in the exact same way. And I would say among any issue that exists out there, being that my job was to take fire and return fire, I think this is one issue that I've earned the right to speak on. And there's a lot of things that we need to do. I think there's two fronts that we need to address this on. And when we talk about these two fronts, we should never confuse the fact that there is no silver bullet for all of this. I don't think that that's the case whatsoever. But number one, what's going on with education of our youth? I was in a 7th grade class just recently, and among the many things that we spoke about there, two things that almost every 7th grader mentioned was that two of their favorite movies were John Wick and The Hitman's Bodyguard. Both R-rated movies, both, of the manner that you can understand. That has effect on our young people. Also talking about their favorite games, first-person shooter games like Call of Duty. Now, that's not the end-all, be-all. For the people that are my opponents on what I've said about increased gun control, I make this point. Look, I can acknowledge, I have a big collection of firearms. I've been a long-time NRA member, and I can say this, not one of my firearms ever walked out of my house. It never wakes up angry. When one of my kids does something wrong, if they hit one of the other ones with a stick, I don't punish the stick. I don't cut down the tree. I punish my children. We're talking about individual actions, but for anybody out there, they shouldn't deny the correlation between the platforms of firearms that are used and the level of lethality that's gone on in these shootings, whether you're talking about what happened in Parkland, which I lost a friend there, whether you're talking about with Omar Mateen in Orlando, Florida, whether you're talking about with Stephen Paddock in Las Vegas. It's not always the case. You can be lethal with a number of firearms, but there are common denominators here, and I think our founders would roll in their graves if they thought we weren't debating these issues.
And debating, and as you said, taking weapons like the AR-15 off the streets, in your opinion, as somebody who's been in combat and used weapons similar to that, as you pointed out.
Yeah, I mean, I saw you had this conversation on there, and I got hit for saying, well, it's not the same thing that we carry in combat. Well, it's not the exact same thing that we carry in combat, but it's very, very similar, and it functions in almost the exact same way in this way. In combat, most of us train one shot, one kill, and when we're functioning in combat, I've never operated on 3-round burst unless you're carrying a fully automatic firearm. You're not operating on full auto unless you're carrying a saw or something like that. So we're operating in combat in the exact same way that those firearms operate off the shelf here in the civilian world.
Mr. Freeman said, well, he'll be our guest in the week upcoming, said he respects Brian Mast. He said, however, we absolutely need, his words, a representative with true conservative values, a representative who speaks, represents, and legislates without regard for personal political ambition. His ads have been out. Big supporter, he says in his ads, of Trump and the Second Amendment. And Brian Mast, we're talking about that. Mark Freeman of Stewart talking about that as well as others. Freeman said that in a statement, and so refer to that, please.
Look, the one way that I operate, I think it comes from my service in the military, and I think it's important to talk about this, especially on the heels of Memorial Day right now. I learned the two most important things there. Number one, you never ask your soldiers to do something that you wouldn't do yourself or you hadn't already done yourself. That has to be a pinnacle trait of good leadership. But beyond that, and almost to the same point of whatever quote it is that you're referencing there, The most important thing that I learned on the heels of Memorial Day is this: you serve in Congress and anywhere else the same way that you serve in combat, the same reason that people are lining row after row in Arlington National Cemetery. You don't worry about personal gain. You don't worry about personal sacrifice, becoming rich or famous or anything else. You do it because you're doing the right thing. That's how I operate every day.
Dave Cummings, running against you, talked about, and I want you to respond to this because he talked about him to the point, talked about, and I said to him, you said promises are being made and broken without a thought, and said, quote, military service is shamelessly used to get votes. I said, are you referring to Mr. Mast? And eventually he said, not just you, but including you. He said, I think we see that more often than not. I think it's important the public understands those of us who served. He did as well. We all have a story. In fact, half of your viewing audience has. But we need to approach this as if we serve. It's our duty. Don't make too much of it. Respond to that criticism, that he's basically saying you're making too much of your military service using that, wearing that a little too thickly in your run.
Well, I'll address it both on the military side and on a Christianity side, because I think it's good to layer it on two ways, right? I'm a Christian in practice. I've grown up as a person of faith, and I don't go out there and share that and talk about that because it's necessarily going to gain a vote or lose a vote. It's part of who I am. It affects my decision making. It drives the way that I think. In the same way, I was a lifelong member of the military. That's what I planned to do for the bulk of my career. It encompassed almost the entire breadth of my adult life. That makes me who I am. The things that happened to me, the things that I overcome, the things that I learned, the trials, the failures that I had there and the successes that I had there, that makes me who I am. And if I somehow forgot about that or didn't share that with people, I think I would be doing an injustice.
Let's talk to another topic, the ACA. Wall Street Journal, I just read about new efforts to try and repeal ACA. I want to talk about that, but you had originally voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act.
Absolutely.
That vote did not, at the end of the day, pass muster. And one group, a new ad by the liberal advocacy group, Floridians for a Fair Shake, says this in part, quote, Congressman Mast talks a good game on health care, but his voting record, quoting here, belies his words. We're exposing his real record that he's collecting obscene amounts of cash from the insurance and pharmaceutical industries. In exchange, they get to gouge aging Floridians.
I think, so number one, when you talk about who was advocating most for keeping the ACA, it was insurance companies, because they were making out on that plan. They were guaranteed to go out there and provide, and on top of that, they were getting what's known as cost-sharing reductions. They were getting subsidies from the federal government. They loved the ACA. It was the best thing for their profits, and you can see where their stocks have gone since having the ACA. They were not out there clamoring for us to repeal the ACA. But let's talk about the ACA and its repeal and our replacement plan and how it affected Floridians very here specifically on a couple of fronts. Number one, on the lower end of the insured scale, that bill was going to put an additional $400 million into the Medicaid program. Florida was a non-expansion Medicaid state, so that was big dollars into Florida's Medicaid program. It was a program that
block grants.
In that form, yes. So it goes into the Medicaid program there. Beyond additional, above and beyond what was there already. As it relates to our seniors, it had nothing to do with anybody that was on Medicare whatsoever. If you're on Medicare, that was something that only touched the individual market. So when you talk about what was going on there, and we did do something on it, we repealed the individual mandate.
That's true.
And that was something that didn't carry over from the original bill text, but we got it done in the tax bill text. That's one of the most important things we could have done for this community.
You're aware, I presume, of this new push going on the Hill right now. Some say it's not the time to bring it up. It's such a tough issue politically for the campaign, but according to the Wall Street Journal, the newest proposal just out, if it comes and bubbles to the surface in the next few weeks, would end the AC expansion of Medicaid, funnel money to states in the form of block grants, likely include some ACA consumer protections, as well as expansion of health savings accounts. Are you on board with all of that?
A lot of those things. I mean, when you look at the expansion of health savings account, that's good for some people don't care about it. When you look at what's going on with block granting down there to the states, that's one of the best things that you can do, is put the dollars at the lower level so that those are closest to the patient can go out there and make sure that the dollars are being spent in a wise and accountable way. Those are good programs right there.
It will be a contentious debate all the way to the fall. Your Democratic opponents, should you pass muster in the Republican primary, are arguing, at least broadly, for perhaps an expansion of Medicare. Don't rule out a discussion about single payer. It's going to be one of the prime issues, pocketbook issues for the fall.
I think it's, single payer is not the direction that we need to go in. And I think that really shows the very clear choice that existed in the last election and exists in this election. On one side of it, you have those of us that are pushing less Uncle Sam, less government involvement, more private sector, more individual choice. On the other side, you have those that are pushing more Uncle Sam, more government involvement, more dollars out of your pocket to go out there and fund things. That's the very clear difference.
I want to talk to you about a few other issues. SNAP benefits. Some residents on the Treasure Coast this week said anyone who doesn't support that's out of touch. A group of community leaders got together urging Congress not to pass a bill that included changes and perhaps cuts they worry to the Supplemental Nutrition Program SNAP. They said far too many people be impacted. You had voted in favor of the bill. Now that farm bill right now is going to have to come back for another vote. They're worried that when it comes back for a second do-over, they might lose SNAP benefits, and they say you're out of touch. What do you say to them in their protest?
I proudly voted in favor of those SNAP benefit changes. Let's look at what those are. Number one, they don't affect people with children. What we're talking about are able-bodied individuals, and I think we get into a dangerous conversation there when we ask the federal government to go out there and say that there's a bar on able-bodied, because the reality of the situation is you're talking to a guy missing 2 legs and a finger. If I only went to work when I was 100%, well, I would never go to work again. So we're talking about people with no children between a certain age bracket, that there's going to be work requirements for those that have SNAP provisions. That's one of the best provisions I think we can make, when nearly every single employer that I talk to in this area says, I need more workers, I need more workers, I need more workers. It's the most common thread that I hear. People cannot find the help out there.
Sugar policy, again, the changes that would essentially have impacted some of the help that the sugar industry gets in terms of price supports would have gone away. Again, that's been held off. It could come back for another vote. You were supportive of changes to some of the construct of sugar policy and farm policy in general, not earning you friends in parts of the Glades. Again, that may come back for another vote. Your response to those in the industry, the ag industry, the sugar industry, who had called it a bankruptcy act for sugar had it passed. This is going to come back up again.
We're changing the price floor in there, and that's something that's completely fair. I think we understand here as residents of the Treasure Coast, recognizing everything that's gone in our waterways, that the status quo needs to change. And when you look at who voted on that, it was myself, in Florida that is, it was myself, it was Representative DeSantis and Representative Francis Rooney, who faces the same issues that we face here on the Treasure Coast with the St. Lucie. He faces the same issues over on the west coast of Florida with the Caloosahatchee.
Again, U.S. Sugar had been quoted. Judy Sanchez had told T.C. Palm, again, it'd be the Sugarcane Farmers Bankruptcy Act. And they said we often forget about the little people in agriculture out there. It said it could lead to massive oversupplies, collapse in prices, loss of sugar production and jobs. What do you say to constituents, the little guy out in the Glades who worries about that aspect of it?
Look, I care about every farmer out there, and I don't want to put anybody out of business. But when you talk about a system that limits the amount that somebody can go out there and produce, I don't think that that's looking out for the little guy.
Final thought on 2 issues that you've been front and center on. One, the reservoir. You've been talking about trying to push that through this year. And also, where do you stand and where do we stand right now on Brightline? First on the reservoir, then Brightline.
Reservoir. This was a huge week for the reservoir. Number one, earlier in the year, we saw full funding for the repairs around the Lake Okeechobee Reservoir. I asked to be on transportation and infrastructure. I told you I'd do that 2 years ago. I asked to be on the subcommittee of water resources and environment. That was my plan. They put me there. This week, we accomplished the biggest things that we could for our waterfront. So number one, we got this authorization for the Southern Storage Reservoir that had to happen at the congressional level. That went through. We secured a placeholder to say that there will be a review for the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, the level that they can keep Lake Okeechobee at in 2019 as a result of the fact that we're going to completing the repairs around the dike sooner rather than later. Algal blooms are a big piece of that problem. The Corps of Engineers tells me constantly, because I ask them constantly, they tell me they can't clean up the flow of 4 million gallons a minute of algal blooms, which is what they're often releasing into our coastal estuaries. I asked the Corps what they needed. They said they need multi-year funding to go out there and develop the technology to clean it at that level. We got them $3 million a year for the next 5 years to go out there and study that. Also in that bill, we got beach renourishment for St. Lucie County. So these are big things all relating to our water.
Our time is limited, but Brightline, where do we stand right now?
Brightline. So number one, we're waiting on the Coast Guard. They're going to get back to us with an answer probably sometime in mid to early August about how much time our train drawbridges can remain in the down position because that's how it affects our waterways. They're not allowed to be an impediment to our waterways. So they're going to make a determination, and Brightline will very very likely have to adjust their schedules given how much time they can put those train bridges in the down position. And I know you've also talked about the Office of Government Reform, the government reform hearings that we've had in Congress, where we're looking at their private activity bonds and the fact that they were received in not an above board way.
Congressman, you've always said yes to every interview request here, and we hope to have you back when it's
debate
time in the summer.
Here for a debate. I would suspect that.
We'll look forward to having you to sit here in July or on into August as part of that debate. As always, we appreciate your time. Wish you and the family the best. Thanks for being our guest.
Always good to see you.
Good to see you, Congressman. Coming up next, our roundtable takes a look at political donations attracting a lot of attention.